how is the image of the United States is being shaped. And he will make some introductory remarks, and then we will open it up for questions and answers. So, welcome, Mr. McCarthy. Welcome to ADA University, and I hope this will be an interesting lecture, so I pass the floor to you.
Faris, thank you so much. You pay for things. You get people to do what you want them to do. The US has a certain amount of economic power as well, not as strong as its military power. And then we come to soft power. And soft power, as you probably know, and I'm not here to give you a lecture on international relations theory, is far more diffuse. Not entirely up to a government. A lot of US soft power comes from non-state actors. Hollywood, for example, is an enormous source of US soft power, for better or for worse. A lot of you have seen how American movies and TV serials have affected populations around the world. We've had the interest, for example, in Iran in the movie Argo with Ben Affleck, which was very popular in Iran because it looked at a particular part of their history when they took the US embassy hostages back in 1979 and the effects that had. But there's also the deleterious effects of Hollywood soft power. We've seen people make movies very offensive to Islam, which have been spread around the world, and have caused protests, and some people have been killed. So soft power is very volatile, very hard to control. The US government does not have control over what Hollywood or any other cultural outlet makes, but it's there, for better or for worse. There are some international relations experts who think soft power is worth nothing. Niall Ferguson being among the leaders of that. He's a historian, and he says that soft power is useless precisely because it's soft, and that nothing really has any effect on other countries unless you have some real military or economic leverage over them. That's a debate that we can have later. But my thought today was to look at three areas of soft power, three areas of the world where the US soft power has been either in evidence or not. And I'll take these directly from my own experience because I think that's what I can really add to the discussion today, having spent some time as a foreign correspondent around the world. I would preface it by saying that one of the unique aspects, I think, of the United States and its soft power is that the US is a nation of immigrants, as you know. Anyone who gets a visa to the United States and works hard can have a good life in the United States. And I think that helps when foreigners look at the United States. It's easy to imagine you too could be an American. You may not want to be, but you can imagine that. It's pretty impossible for a foreigner to imagine becoming Chinese. That's not going to happen. And in fact, many countries around the world, you can't really become part of that country. You can live there as a foreigner, but you would never become a Chinese or a Japanese or whatever. In the United States, you can become an American. And that's an enormous sense of power the US has, of draw over foreigners. Wow, I could actually be part of that country, this beacon of freedom, of prosperity and opportunity. I'm not saying that this is good for everyone, but it is there, and it is something that clearly attracts a lot of people. Foreign students, about 26% of all foreign students around the world go to the United States. Clearly there's something there that is attractive to foreigners. So let me look at three areas around the world where I think US soft power is a subject worthy of looking at. I'm going to start with Ireland. I'm originally from Ireland. I'm an American citizen, but I grew up in Ireland. And then I'm going to move to Iraq, and I'm going to end up in China. And I lived in all these countries, so I have some personal experience. Ireland, as you know, is a fractured country, had fought a really nasty civil war for about 30 years, starting in 1969, which killed about 3,000 Northern Ireland citizens, British soldiers, and some from the Republic. I'm from the Republic, from the South. For some years, the British government had been making secret attempts to talk to the IRA, which was the Catholic resistance force, if you like, IRA guerrillas who were well embedded in the north of Ireland, represented the Catholic minority. The British wanted to end the fighting, but they also had said openly, we will not negotiate with terrorists. The British, of course, were still talking to them, they just couldn't admit it openly. And they reached a point under the prime ministership of Tony Blair where they were very close to making an agreement. The IRA too, they sort of realized they weren't getting anywhere with the armed struggle. They too, or at least a significant group within the IRA wanted to stop the fighting. But the British government could not openly admit, nor could they reach out a hand to the IRA. As Tony Blair said, very hard to shake the hand of a terrorist. And for the IRA, too, it was very hard to suddenly be seen to be doing open peace talks with their avowed enemy, the British. The President of the United States at the time was Bill Clinton, and he recognized an opportunity there, and he sent Senator George Mitchell to act as a mediator. A highly respected senator. He arrived, took him about 2 years. He was tireless. He talked and talked and talked. And he finally, in 1998, got the two sides to sit down and sign what is now known as the Good Friday Peace Agreement. It was signed on Good Friday just before Easter, 1998. I remember myself seeing this on CNN. I was in Cambodia, actually, at the time on an assignment. And I came back to my hotel that night and saw it on TV. And I couldn't believe it. Having grown up in Ireland, I could not believe they'd done this deal. I thought it was one of those things that would go on forever. I remember sitting down on my bed, and I was just, tears were coming down my eyes that they'd finally done this after 30 years. But my reflection then was, without the United States, that would not have happened. There was no other country in the world that could have sent somebody to broker a peace deal like that. And it's important, when we're talking about soft power here, to realize that the United States involvement, there were no US troops involved whatsoever. There was no mention of US troops, nor was there any intention to send US troops. Nor was there any real economic inducement. The US was not paying for this to happen. There was no transfer of money from Washington to Belfast or Dublin or London. It was purely predicated on the reputation and the standing of the United States, which, as you know, in Ireland is very high. There are many Irish immigrants in the United States. The reputation of the US in Ireland is very high. Every US president ends up making a trip to Ireland, even though it's a tiny little country, to bolster his or her image. And so there was a sense there that the power of the United States was behind this deal, and therefore it was something that both sides could believe in, could trust, and the deal was done. And as you know, today we have peace in Northern Ireland. It's a little bit fractious, but the killings are basically over. That enormous reservoir of goodwill, to me, represents US soft power at its best. And it comes from years and years of transatlantic relationship, from lots of trade and diplomatic ties. Many Americans have been to Ireland, many Irish people have been to the United States, British also. And so you have a very close relationship there, and then when it counted, you could turn that into a real deal. Let's move now to Iraq, 2003. The United States was still in post-traumatic shock, I think, from 9/11. And there were factions within the Bush administration who were both angry and scared. And I think these are the two emotions that prevail at the time. Angry that the US had been attacked, scared that something could happen again. And their response, and I'm talking about people like Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, the vice president, was let's go out and hit these bad guys before they hit us again. They were looking around for a target. And of course the problem was bin Laden was stuck in some cave in Afghanistan or Pakistan, we didn't know where at the time, and weren't going to discover him for another 12 years. And they didn't know who they were going to attack. And so the idea was, let's attack Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Now, I don't want to rewrite the entire history, but as you know, the US concocted this very flimsy intelligence case that Iraq had the weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be false. They took it to the UN, could not get the UN to sign off on this. And then the US decided to go ahead unilaterally. You're either with us or you're against us, as you recall, President Bush said. And in they went to Iraq. And I was in Kuwait at the time and followed them up through, across the berm and up to Baghdad. The actual toppling of Saddam Hussein went pretty quickly. And he was not largely mourned around the Middle East, nor even in Iraq. He was a brutal dictator and had done some very terrible things. But the US, once it had toppled Saddam, then proceeded to make the situation much worse by its sheer cultural and socioeconomic incompetence in the Iraqi arena. It did not understand the makeup of Iraq. Very few people, either certainly in the military, but even in the diplomatic service, spoke any Arabic. At one point, the US Embassy had swelled to 1,000 US staff. 1,000 US staff is enormous, of which 6 spoke Arabic. So out of 1,000 diplomats, only 6 spoke Arabic. So the US was involved in this large and complicated situation, not really understanding the country that it was in, and proceeded to commit a series of extraordinary errors. The most blatant one, of course, which went around the world, was the treatment of prisoners in Abu Ghraib, and the pictures of those men with the hoods over their heads and the being tied up in strange ways. But there was a series of horrendous mistakes that were made, which alienated many people in Iraq and also many people across the Middle East. At the same time, much of what was going on in Iraq was being broadcast on Al Jazeera. Now, in the first Gulf War invasion, 1991, the only real cable channel covering it was CNN. And basically, CNN was following the American troops as sort of the home team. Al Jazeera took a much more skeptical view of this invasion and broadcast a lot of images that the United States did not like, lots of images of people being killed. And that started to turn a lot of the Middle East against the US occupation of Iraq. But it had effects even further outside of the Middle East. So you'll recall when the French led the effort in the UN to block any action in Iraq, the US congressmen saw this as a betrayal and became very petty, and you'll recall they renamed French fries freedom fries. And this was an attempt to be nasty to France. A pretty short-sighted view. The Germans were equally skeptical of this military venture into Iraq. By July of 2003, the Germans were so mad at what was going on and couldn't understand why the US would do this, that fully 30% of Germans under 30 actually believed that the United States had staged 9/11. Now, you've probably heard that there were rumors to this effect in Pakistan and the Middle East, but these were Germans in Western Europe who had already given troops for Afghanistan 2 years before, and basically on the same side, members of NATO, and now 30% of young Germans thought the US had actually made it all up. In Britain, probably the US's most staunch ally in all of Europe, the sentiment started to tip against the US as the occupation dragged on, as the insurgency got worse. Britain had sent troops to Iraq, unlike the French and the Germans. A lot of them got killed. They were in the south, in Basra. So by the end of the British involvement in Iraq, they pulled their troops out in 2010, I think. The British were virulently against that war. And as we saw when Obama asked for British help in Syria, he was stunned when the British Parliament voted against action against Syria when Assad used chemical weapons in Damascus. And it was clear from the debate in the British Houses of Parliament that the fundamental reason that the British voted against any action against Syria was because of the Iraq war. They felt they'd been misled in Iraq, the intelligence was faulty, and there was enough doubt to say, well, how can we believe you when you now come and tell us that Bashar Assad used chemical weapons in Damascus? Now, I think the case for Assad's using chemical weapons has been pretty convincingly made, not least by the United Nations itself. But that was the level of distrust and resentment in the UK against what Bush had done in Iraq. It carried on for another 12 years and came back to bite them last August, in the British House of Parliament. But there's even one worse fallout from that. As I mentioned, Ireland is probably the most pro-American country in Europe. In 2006, 2007, the Irish began to demonstrate against US troops going into the Middle East. And one of the reasons for this is that there's an airport quite close to where I grew up in the west of Ireland, Shannon Airport, which, and Ireland is not a member of NATO, but Shannon has a very long runway. And the US was using Shannon Airport as a refueling stop for the troops that were sent from the US, continental US. They would land in Shannon, refuel, and then they would fly on to wherever it might be, Bishkek or Pakistan or Baghdad. And this was done, it was never questioned in the Irish Parliament. It was accepted that the Irish would help the United States, even though we're not a member of any military alliance, until the Irish public started to protest this. And that I mention that because that's a really stunning development in the depletion of your soft power. If one of your closest friends starts to protest what you're doing, you're in deep trouble. And I think, you know, the Irish don't have any economic or military power, certainly nothing compared to the United States. So there was no real threat to the US, except in this notion that they lost the battle of hearts and minds in Ireland. And if they couldn't keep the Irish on board, God knows how could they keep the Middle East on board. So now, fast forward to today, and we're in the Middle East again, haven't really left, and we're faced with this horrendous problem of ISIS and how we deal with them. And the US has had to dig really deep to get an alliance of nations to help face down ISIS. I think it is more a measure of the horrendous brutality and barbarism of ISIS than a measure of US residual soft power in the Middle East that they've managed to assemble this coalition. The Saudis have been very instrumental in helping. They had initially been backing a lot of the Sunni resistance in Syria, but I think they realized the threat from ISIS getting too extreme. And so they've lined up Qatar, Bahrain, Egypt, and so on. And then the British and the French and so on have come on board. But it wasn't a done deal. And had it been for anything less than stopping a group of genocidal maniacs who crucify people, stone women to death in public, and cut journalists' heads off, I think it could have been a harder sell. But I'm going to add one more part to this before I stop and ask for your questions, because I think it illustrates how variegated and how unpredictable soft power is. I want to look at Asia. The primary concern that the United States has in Asia now is managing the rise of China. And I use the word managing with some deliberate forethought. The Chinese fear that the United States is trying to contain China. And parallels are made to the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The situation is not analogous for one fundamental reason, which is during the Cold War, the United States did not trade with the Russians or with the Soviets. The Comecon system and the Western capitalist system were two disparate units and were basically competing with in a zero-sum game. We do an enormous amount of trade with China, half a trillion dollars a year, $500 billion US dollars a year. The Chinese have enormous ownership of US Treasury bonds. We have huge imports and exports. It's not in the US interest nor in China's interest for any confrontation or to somehow cut China off at the knees. However, China is a young power, at least in its current governmental structure, is a little bit clumsy as it goes around the world, has been alienating a lot of its Asian neighbors, and there is a clear desire across East Asia for US, if you like, hand-holding to ensure that the Chinese don't go too far in asserting their power, particularly in the oceans around China. So we see a very strong call from the Japanese, from the Filipinos, the Indonesians, the Thais, the Vietnamese, the Malaysians, Singaporeans, for the US to help. But I would argue that in terms of soft power, not only does the US enjoy large reservoirs of goodwill in all these East Asian nations that it has fostered since the Second World War, has allowed to grow up under the US security blanket, which was basically put in place to keep back the Soviets after the Second World War, has opened its markets, enabled the enormous economic advances of first Japan and Korea and Taiwan, and then the next level of the Thais, the Malaysians, Singaporeans, and so on. And the US has also been a big home of Asian immigrants I live in Los Angeles. We have an enormous Asian population there. A lot of Asians send their kids to university in the United States. So there's an enormous reservoir of goodwill there. But I would argue that it also applies in China. And if you think of, if soft power really means the ability to influence people by the example you set, by people's like to live like that, that has had an enormous influence on China as well. China looks at the United States as another great country. China sees itself as a great country. The US is more economically developed than China. The Chinese know that. And they look very closely at what we do. And in many cases, they try and copy it, and with some success. The Chinese themselves do not want a conflict with the United States. They have some military issues. They don't like the US aircraft carriers patrolling up and down their coast. They have some economic issues, particularly when we had our economic crisis in 2008. The Chinese were very dismissive of the US economy and thought we were going to go bust. Well, it didn't happen. But on the soft power level, the Chinese still, in many ways, look up to the United States. They might not admit that very openly, but it is quite clearly the case. When you go to a US university campus now, for example, in Los Angeles, the two big campuses, UCLA and USC, they have enormous Asian populations, of which mainland Chinese are by far the largest number. So there's a huge attraction, even in China, to the United States, which in the longer term I think is very good, both for China and for the United States. Anyone who's studied the United States for a couple of years or more will come back to China with a much more enlightened view of what the United States stands for than what they might get in their official media. They will be mostly lifelong friends of the US, which is good for the US and good for China. And I think it works both ways. So this is a country, United States, which has made some horrendous mistakes in one part of the world, the Middle East, has lost some of its reservoir of goodwill, if you like, or its soft power as a result of that. And yet, in another part of the significant part of the world, it still is seen as a very important player. I think that the domestic political situation is not helping. As you know, the rise of the Tea Party in particular, but also on the left wing of the Democratic Party, there are people who would like the US to turn back inwards on itself. We are in one of those cycles again. The US goes through these cycles of openness, closing, open, closing to the world, and we're on one of these closing cycles now. The president himself, by his instinct, is not that interested in engaging with the world. He wants to pull back. He's being forced to reverse that, but it's not his. He wants to fix stuff at home. He's not that interested in spending a lot of his time on foreign policy, which is part of the reason why the world is not very happy with him. But it's made worse by the constant partisan sniping in Congress. Most recently, we saw the commitment to bomb ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and the president said, which I think probably expresses the views of most Americans, that he did not want to commit US troops to the ground, onto the ground. And no sooner had he said that than the Republican leader of the House, John Boehner, came out and said, that's ridiculous. We're clearly going to need US troops on the ground. And I don't think Boehner is saying that because he really knows anything about ISIS. He's certainly